myself than I would. So it is all yours.
Not a problem. Well, thank you everybody for having me here. I'm really excited to talk to you. Yeah, so we're going to talk about kind of like multi-agent and the way that multiple agents will interact with each other, but I also want to bring in a lot about like the way that multi-agents end up working with other human beings. And so just so you get some idea of a background for me, I've been a product manager for a really long time. I've worked at a lot of different companies, as you can see here. Right now, I'm at GitHub as the basically staff product operations person. So I think an awful lot about the way that our product managers do their work. We're also doing a lot of things like automating various aspects of our work using GitHub, and I'll talk a little bit about how I think of as GitHub as like a multi-agent use case. I'm also the lead champ for responsible AI for GitHub. So I think an awful lot about these ideas of like ethics and moral decision-making within these contexts. But I am, you know, even though I was trained as an engineer and I have an understanding of technical kind of concepts, I would say that I take it more from a human-computer interface standpoint. So I want to make sure that's clear. I want to talk about, like, I'd heard you're now trying to kind of go from a PRD to actual architecture and interaction models. And so that's something that during the discussion part of this, we should just like talk about. But I wanted to go through a couple different experiences that I've had, just so you can see how I've applied kind of my thinking around multi-agent has actually evolved over, I guess, maybe the last, it's almost 7 years now. So with that, let me go forward. Oh, one thing I did want to mention is that I'm also a Maven teacher. If you're interested in learning more about what I'll call AI design patterns, this is a course that I'm teaching. I just did my first cohort that finished last week. And if you want to, there's a code here I'll share with you if you want to get 10% off. But this course goes over about 4 weeks. It's a lecture, then workshop every week. And so anyways, happy to answer questions about that, but just wanted to let people know that I'm also doing it. So the first thing that I really came across, I would say, multi-agent situations was when I was working at a company called Philosophy, which was like a boutique design consultancy. And we were doing a project for PwC and Google. And what this was for was basically to try to take the practices of consultants and turn them into tools and platforms so that required less consultants to actually do the job. And so that meant that PwC could make more money. They could also expand the types of customers that they would go after. And so one of the domains was this thing called field service operations, which, if you're not familiar with what field service operations is, it's essentially whenever you can't like return something to the manufacturer to have it fixed, and someone has to go on site to actually troubleshoot and fix the thing. So in this case, gas stations are a great example. And in this case, Larson was a company by which they would not only construct gas stations, but they would also go out and repair them. And it was a very actually technical job because the gas station was essentially just like a bunch of different networked objects together. And so you can see here, they were opening up this thing. I spent 3 days in this van driving around just to observe how the field techs did their work. And I spent another 2 days watching how dispatchers would do their work inside the office. And so we started to think about this as like basically a bunch of different people. And so this is a technique that I've used in a bunch of different places called rich picture, which is it's kind of like so a lot of the techniques and workshops that I end up doing are very inclusive of both technical and non-technical people. And so in this case, we had a bunch of the people that were dispatchers, field techs, even executives. We would work with them to build this map. And so there were a bunch of different people, and then there were systems that were intermediating those people. And so this was kind of the map of how Larson ended up. This was the initial one, at least. It got more complex as time went on. But you can also see those little red X's. Those are where there's like frictions in the way that these different, basically, actors work with each other and are intermediated by these different technologies. From there, we did a lot of research. And so this is, I wanted to just show this because this was like a synthesizing session after we did a bunch of research for usability of a particular prototype. We started to break things into whether people understood what was going on, which is the vertical, and how they felt about it. So basically, like if they were positively, like if it was below the line, we just kind of assumed we had to fix up things because they just didn't understand what was going on. And that was a bad thing. They couldn't even interpret what was happening. But the upper right was where they understood and liked it. And what we really thought about is how, like, of these things, these were the things that people wanted to have automated in some way. And then the upper left-hand corner where they understood what was happening, but they didn't like it. We originally thought it was all about job security issues. And after kind of thinking about this over like a couple of years after that, I started to realize that there's actually two things that we need to think about when it comes to humans interacting with these systems. And the upper right is actually, this is the bullshit parts of their job. And these are the things that they want automated because they don't like doing. But then on the left side, these are things that they're actually afraid of losing because they're meaningful parts of their job in some way. And so I think as you start to think about the way that human beings actually interact with multiple agents is like, what things are the bullshit jobs that they don't want to do that the agent should do? And then what are the really meaningful things that they get out of their job that maybe they should be aided with, and you want to have more assistive types of technologies rather than pure agent technologies. So I think it's like a very interesting thing for me to realize. And so the problems we were trying to solve, like there were a bunch of them. It ended up being like dispatchers were really busy, field service was very reactive, the warehouse didn't really know what to order in advance. And one of the most successful prototypes we ended up building was actually something that was a hybrid between a job management system. So on the left-hand side, you'd see that there was like a job here for a particular gas station. There were various statuses, different types of predictive systems about like, could we take the transcript of what the problem was and try to predict what the problem actually was, what the solution could be, what parts were necessary, and what field text would need to be there. And so that was kind of a bunch of different types of models that were more predictive models. And then we created something here where if you see that there's like Patrick is actually a bot inside of this system with a bunch of other people. And so this was way back in like 2017. And so when we were starting to think about this, we really want to understand that like Peggy was an actual person. And Patrick would then do a bunch of work to add the right people, to add a bunch of information to the project. And we found this to be very successful, actually. And again, there were things that they really wanted to have taken care of, and there were other things that they didn't want. And so this was like a very interesting kind of first concept for me of multi-agent, where it's not so much about just me and an agent interoperating, but it's about this idea that the agent is with a group of people and that you could actually have multiple agents that's starting to work together. So that's where this really started. Yeah.
Can I interrupt you with the question? Because I feel like there's a lot of valuable information and we might just move on and
Sure.
won't be able to get back to this point.
Yeah.
Because while working on that automation, you mentioned that there's like a like bullshit job that people didn't want to do and the meaningful jobs, right?
Yeah.
But from the business value, it doesn't really matter what people think. It actually matters what's the best business value of the automation process, right? So while
I would disagree with that.
Yep.
Yeah, and the reason why I would disagree with that is that, you know, there's a podcaster, Dart, who talks about humans for work, and work is actually like a marketplace. And so, yes, I mean, there's definitely a discussion right now about the idea of replacement of people with agents. But the problem is that like, to actually do some of these things, you need a human to do it. And when it comes to that, like one of the things I would say here, the things that they found most meaningful was actually helping people be really upset, calm down, and then get the solution taken care of. And so, yes, you could probably maybe simulate an agent of doing that. But when people know that it's not a real person, they would not like feel the same way, is what I would argue. What they want is they want a human to empathize with them and to be compassionate. And so that's where I get your point about like business value is very important, but there's also like other ideas rather than just the transactional nature of servicing a customer. It's about relationships. And so I think like once we start talking about agents as systems that are, you know, probably, you know, in the next couple of years will be everywhere, the only way you differentiate is actually the relationship you have with your customer. And so anyways, that's what I would say.
But once the agent can provide similar or even better service to the client, why would it stop business from integrating the agent instead of people in that spot?
Well, I think that it makes a lot of sense for things that are potentially not necessary. Like again, for very chaotic or complex types of situations, I would argue that people are going to, even if they're assisted by agents in some way, they're given information, right? There's still like, so there's an interesting study that came out of, it was a military think tank where they were looking at how people felt about drones versus manned vehicles in the air over battlefield theaters. And so what that meant was that if like in the US, the A-10s versus these like Raptor drones, people that were on the ground felt safer that there were people with butts and seats in the A-10s and that they would make better decisions because they were in theater versus drones that were halfway across the world. And so I think there's still this thing about like human perception and interpretation of what's going on that I think I don't know. I guess what I'm saying is like, there probably is like a threshold by which these things become so real that we have a hard time telling. I would argue though that we still want people interacting with people. Because so that's, I guess, maybe the balance that I want to talk about here is like, I think you're probably right that eventually we'll get to that like functionality level, but I would say that there's still something really valuable about like being a human talking with another human.
Yeah, thank you so much. Do you want to take more?
No, but this is a really good discussion, by the way. Let's talk about it more, because I think that there really are valuable things about having humans in the loop around these things. And again, a human in the loop is such like a weird term, because the truth is we're talking about networks. We're not talking about singular like one-to-one types of conversations anymore, because it's about everything that takes place within a system to actually provide.
My main question was regarding the decision making for the management, how to pick the spot which needs to be automated. And from my understanding, probably like the definition of like shitty job and like interesting stuff is not actually the biggest, the parameter with the highest value of making decision regarding that.
Well, I think one of the things that we need, like if we, I have some conversation in my course that where we talk about like what are machines good for versus human beings. And so I would say that like humans do make a lot of errors, right? Like, and that's maybe the number one thing that assistive like AI technologies will do is help avoid or fix those errors, essentially. But what we can do when it comes to the nuance of a situation, right? So when we talk about the complexity of a situation, it's one of the things that human beings can do is make exceptions to their training to actually do something. Now, could you also have an agent that then would eventually make those exceptions too? Maybe, right? But I think that there's like, in the next like, while, we still need to have humans doing things that they, one, care about, because you want employees that are happy, and two, the customers will expect to be able to deal with humans in certain cases, is what I would argue. So I think it's a really good discussion, by the way. So let's keep talking about it. And as you think about, as I kind of show you a couple other cases that I've been thinking about, I'd love to hear how you think about it after we talk. Okay.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yeah, you're welcome. Cool. So one theory that I always wanted to, I've thought about a lot is this idea of like actor network theory, and I'm happy to link to the post so you can read through it. But it really comes down to this idea that we are basically intermediated by technologies. And so this is from an article I wrote on O'Reilly about what I was calling kind of communal computing, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a second. But it's really about this idea that there are, technologies and people, but when we start thinking and talking about actor network theory, we actually mean that there's just like actants and there's networks that connect them, but that there's symmetry in the way that we probably shouldn't worry about as much whether one is a human or not, but we have to in some way allow for them to then do translation between each other, because communication is kind of a lossy concept. And so I think when we start thinking about this stuff, you should think about this idea of networks and network flow, and the way that you end up like, because the thing that gets really interesting and very hard about this is that you can spec out each individual agent or the way the person should engage with the technology, but there's going to then be emergent behavior that happens and comes through this actor network theory, essentially. So I think we should talk about this like after I give you a couple more like case studies that I've been involved with about how do you start to actually understand and judge the idea of emergent behavior out of networked systems. And so there's actually interesting stuff that we can learn from like agent-based modeling, which is something from even the 80s, and NetLogo, where people were simulating people, etc. So anyways, I always just want to bring up this theory. I think it's one that's interesting that maybe can give you some language and some like underpinning around how these things might work in a network. The next case study I want to talk about, where started to think about, again, multi-agent situations, was for the Portal device, which is now unfortunately defunct. I was a product manager on the Portal device working on identity. And identity was very interesting here because it was actually a communal device. Some people would have actual accounts on here, whereas others might just walk up and use the device without an account. I also did biometric recognition, which included face and voice systems. And that was then to link to identity on the device. And then finally, voice assistant integration. And so that included Alexa and then Facebook's own internal, basically like a voice assistant. And one of the things that was like very interesting, and I don't know if you're going to be able to hear this or not, but
a request for a proposal.
Can you hear that?
I really don't need a proposal. I don't want to waste your time.
Fill out this request for a proposal.
All right. Can I just send you an email or something? Is there an email anywhere?
Fill out the request for proposal.
Okay. All right. Contact person. That's me, right?
Contact person.
My name? I guess that's my name. I mean, how often do people actually fill out this for other people? Usually the person, okay, anyway. I'll fill out. All right, I'll fill out my name. Enough, right? Okay, email, that makes sense. I assume you need email to contact me. Okay, great. Email, telephone. Do you really need my telephone?
Telephone.
Why do you need my telephone?
You need to fill out everything.
All right, telephone.
Well, the reason why I show this is that it's very interesting to me when we start to think about how do we actually prototype these systems, right? And so prototyping is really hard if you have to build everything, especially when we talk about non-deterministic systems. Like, we don't always have the knowledge to build something. We have to build it from scratch or actually invent it. And so inside the Portal device, one of the things that we were struggling with a bit with our own internal voice assistant was how we should deal with multiple people talking to the device at the same time. And so one of the things we did, and this is a technique that I think is pretty powerful, is we actually role played where two people were people, and then another person would pretend to be the voice assistant. And we trade out 4 or 5 different scenarios by which people would interrupt and how it would feel for the voice assistant to respond in different ways. And so this was like a way for us to actually, within 45 minutes, with about 4 people, we were able to get to what we actually felt was right from a human-computer interface standpoint without having to build anything. And so I think this is one of those things that I've used in a lot of different cases to prototype the systems you have. So if you can get a group of people together, I guess is what I'm saying, you can pretend to be these different things so that you don't actually have to build anything. And then what you can start to look at is like, what are the motivations that are helpful in that particular case? And how might they interact with each other in a way that is helpful? And so I just like to bring this up because I think it's a very interesting case where we use something that was very scrappy and easy to do to actually then figure out how agents should operate with each other. And you can do this in a bunch of different ways with as many agents as you want, as long as you can get people that are there or pretend to be multiple people. So the next thing I wanted to talk about is kind of GitHub as a multi-agent system in itself. And so maybe it's not thought of as like a traditional multi-agent system. But one of the things that GitHub has had for a really long time is actually this thing called actions, right? And so actions right here are essentially automations. And so they're automations that run based on certain types of triggers when you check in code, when certain artifacts are created, when issues are created. There's a bunch of different like assistive or automation technologies that are behind this actions thing. And so this is more of the traditional automation that you'd think about. There's still multiple people that are interacting with, say, a repo, which is our main kind of object or artifact within GitHub. But now there's these automations and bots that are running in the background to do a bunch of stuff. We've then, included this idea of Copilot, which right now is more of a one-on-one type of conversation, right? And even going as far as like Workspace, if people have seen this idea of like actually having entire like PRs being generated by a bot. What I want to say about this is that like, and I can't talk about like everything that we're working on when it comes to this, but I think there's something very interesting about the way that we need to actually have a mix of automations and agents and humans. And so I think one of the things that we should be thinking about when you're trying to make this translation from like a PRD or a spec to agents is that which behaviors are more like guardrail behaviors. And I can go into this more about like how guardrails, when I was at Google, working with the pair team, we came up with something called design policies, which is a way of kind of like speccing out guardrails for your system. And within that system, some of those guardrails may just be pure automation or heuristic based, whereas others may need to actually have more advanced behavior. And so, for example, like there's, oh gosh, where was I going to? Within GitHub, for example, when it comes to like LLMs, this is an example, is that if you've ever like tried to put something into ChatGPT or Gemini, there's actually multiple agents and models that are at play. Now, whether they meet the definition of agents based on what Amir is saying, and we've had like a lot of conversations about this because I think it's a very hard question to answer, actually. And we can talk about like how agents need to actually maybe surprise you and not be aligned with you to be true agents and physical separation, but we can talk about that later. We don't have to get into the philosophical discussion. But I think there's something really interesting that for most LLMs, when you're inputting a prompt, there's actually a bunch of things like heuristics are actually injecting additional parts of the prompt. They're modifying your prompt. There's actually both regex, looking for certain types of keywords like people's names that are famous, versus the idea of like actual models that are looking for things like toxicity, violent speech, things like that, before it even gets to the actual LLM. And then on the way out, the same types of things are happening, right? Heuristic-based, regex, certain types of rule systems, and then also models that are looking for, say, like adult imagery, for example, right? So these are all things where they're already kind of like multi-agent systems in some way. And so I think that's maybe the thing I want to like convey here, is that this combination of like heuristic-based like kind of things or automations with more agentive types of technologies is actually necessary to create this. And especially when things start going off the rails, when the system like gets stuck, for example, there's potentially very simple automations that can help you reset that. Okay, and then the last thing in the speculative. Oh, sure, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure why the automation is still needed if you like a separate entity or element, when you can let the agent also execute the automation part.
Well, because of the fact that like most of the agent-based technologies today are based on LLMs, which are non-deterministic. And so the thing is that for these guardrails, sometimes you don't want the agent to do something weird when you just want it to actually tag the ticket with something based on a heuristic.
Yeah.
So that's what I would argue, right? Is that like there's real value in these systems because they can do things like synthesizing human speech or language, right? Or actually generating images, amazing things. But there's like a time where you just wanted to move a ticket from here to here when something happens. And so like the variability of these things means that you're going to get more errors, which I think is the issue, right? And so we want to try to create systems that are dynamic, but are also not failing in either very stupid ways, right? Because that actually, there's another paper by Parasurman in 1996, I think, about, it's called Trust in Automation, Use, Disuse, Misuse, and Abuse. And it's a seminal paper from my perspective about how we like dial in the right level of trust in a system. But whenever the system makes really stupid errors, people immediately distrust the system. So I think that's the thing, is that we want to use these heuristic-based systems to still block off the stupid mistakes. And then we want to try to actually stop it once it starts to get into these runaway states that end up being kind of bad. And so that's where like emergent behavior is really hard. Like especially, I've taken a bunch of courses from like the Santa Fe Institute, and I follow them a lot. I'm really into like complexity theory and stuff like that. And it is really hard for systems that are truly have what's referred to as strong emergent behavior to actually understand what's going to happen. And so the thing is that not only do you need to build heuristics about like, we definitely don't want these things to happen, right? But you then also need to be able to detect when there is a new problem. And then, stealing things from like SRE and chaos engineering, we need to actually have a good way to then kind of do something to fix that problem quickly, like incident response, right? And so there's always new jailbreaks that are coming out against ChatGPT and other models, right? And during those, and then they're able to turn it around when that jailbreak probably doesn't work as well, at least the next day. And so they have a very good incident response thing. So I think that's the thing that you need to be thinking about, is for these strong emergent behavior systems, is how do you monitor them and how do you build heuristics to keep them contained in some way?
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, you're welcome. So like I said, this was more of a speculative type of thing, and I like speculative stuff, and I'm working on a weird kind of design fiction project, which is like the employee manual of the future. And so it's like, if you join a company 10, 20 years from now, what is that going to be like? And there's a lot of discussion about how digital twins, virtual agents, things like that start to interact within teams, and what is the way that we actually want this to happen. But this particular thing is, how does the Roomba really feel about dog shit? Was actually the combination of some workshops I had done previously around what's referred to as like animism. And animism is this idea of giving personalities or human-like characteristics to an inanimate object. But the reason why we do that is because we want to actually understand how we might want to interact with it and how we might build models in our own heads to be able to interact with these systems. And it was actually a workshop where, so this is like the animistic design of these things. So during this workshop at South by Southwest, we would have people take on different personalities of a device. And so they would then decide like, what are some of the ways that like a Roomba might feel like when would a Roomba feel happy? And what does that mean? And this is related to this idea of like personification enough of technology for us as humans to be able to associate and understand them. But you don't want to like go overboard, right? Like I think there's been a lot of interesting studies about like gendering of like different machine learning algorithms and voice assistants. There's a bunch of stuff like that if you're interested in hearing more. But and so this is like an example of the online workshop where, you know, in this case, like a lamp is about like kindness, generosity, and warmth. And so using this now allows you to say like, okay, well, so this person will have this kind of concept of what a lamp is, but how should a lamp actually interact with people? And so I think this goes to your agents, is that I think when people are actually building mental models about how to discuss and talk or work with agents, they need to build a mental model of what type of agent or actor this is. And so as an actant, like if you want a tutor, there should probably be a tutor that is like tutor-like. And what does that mean? Versus, are there people that are graders, and what are those graders like, and how should they act? And so I think this is trying to get down to like, when you're actually building these agents, especially when they have to interact with human beings, the personality or the personification will happen naturally because of these things being non-deterministic. But I think that you need to really think about like, how should they interpret these things in some way? And so this was like the place where we did it. So it was like a bit of performance art. It was kind of like, you know, we're 100 years in the future, all humans are extinct, and we're now going to go back to a 2020 home and pretend to be a bunch of machines back then. Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, with regards to the AI tutor that you mentioned, I was thinking about, like, if you think about the personality that somebody approaches a teacher or a tutor, wouldn't that be different once they come to know it's an AI? Like even though you might try to form it based on that, but the emotional connect which a person would have would be very different, or the expectations would be very different. So won't we have to sort of have a tone that's always positive?
No, that's what I'm saying is like, I think that people build models inside their heads when it comes to the technology, right? Like and this is like, there's a lot of trust and automation, like in papers in academia, which try to build these like very complex models of like trust and understanding. But the way you should just think about it is that people build models of other people inside their head. And sometimes they will then also build models of things that are of the spectrum of tools to people, okay? And when we think about that, tools are like automations. Like I expect it to be an extension of whatever I need to do, right? It's like the idea of a hammer, right? Versus the idea of a carpenter that I'm working with. Those are two very different things. The problem with this technology is that you're going to have to deal with the fact that it's not always going to be as great as a real human being. And so that is why like you can play, I think, with this idea that you want you want people to build the ability to understand that this non-deterministic thing will kind of operate in this realm. And you want to do it because they're going to personify it a little bit anyways. You want to be able to play with that so that they can better interpret what's going on. But you shouldn't go overboard from the standpoint of them like I think there's like some really deep ethical questions we should be asking ourselves about like virtual partners, for example, right? And that's because like, is that really helping, right? And are they building the right model of your technology to interact with it and trust it the right amount? And that would be the thing I would say. And so here's the thing is that like, actually, yes, people probably want to have like a tutor that is helpful, maybe cheery, like motivational. But then I would say that there is also a need for like, feedback is not meant to feel good necessarily, right? Like good feedback hurts a little bit, but not in a way that is bad, right? Like it's kind of like, if anybody's done like boxing or martial arts, like there's a big difference between your coach, a sparring partner, and an opponent, right? Your coach is there to kind of like look at things, really try to like hone in on key things that you're trying to get better at. The sparring partner is there to make you feel pain and to exploit your weaknesses so you can learn about them. And then your opponent is there to kill you. But like, so there's like a spectrum of these things. And so you probably don't want the opponent there, right? Unless you're building like a gaming AI or something like that. But you want a sparring partner sometimes, right? You want some like that. That's like the whole idea of like Socratic questioning from the standpoint of like how education works, is that you're calling on people randomly, asking them a very hard question in front of everybody else, because it actually forces them to study harder. And it forces them to actually internalize the information better. So that, just using that case again, like I think you should play with this idea of like, how you don't want to dial up the personality too much because they're not real people, but you also want to have maybe different ways that people interact with things based on what the expectation of that type of role would be. That's what I would argue.
Thank you.
Yeah, welcome. Yeah. So anyways, like this is just like an example of where like role play. We had a bunch of people pretending to be lamps and Roombas and things like that, and we had human beings coming in, and then the thing that was very interesting is about that idea of like the actants doing translation between each other. Started to discuss about like how might we build like a communication bus for the home, right? And what information needs to be shared to be able to be helpful, but what is like too much information and actually ends up confusing things in some way. And so when you're thinking about the way that you build your agents and the way that they, you know, end up doing reflection and then create kind of shared history, you should think about like what is helpful information there, right? Because that then ends up going into all the prompts that you tune your agents with to say like what information they're actually providing to other agents in some way. And so I did this like, you know, kind of exploration of what would it mean to have like a group chat with all of your devices in the home. And I think this is like a real issue for like home automation. Ends up being very brittle because it's all like very heuristic rules based, but homes are based on norms, which are constantly changing. So the idea of like, yes, I want a light to turn on when I walk into a room, but that's not the case when like someone is sleeping or a baby is napping. I don't want that to happen, right? And so this is where I think like these types of non-determinate systems, LLMs, and the way that agents work, I think become really interesting and great, is that they can start to internalize and create rule sets that are actually in natural language, so I can also interpret it and adjust as necessary. So I think that's another interesting thing, is like when you're not only debugging this, but you're showing the history of what happened between the agents, there's a real value of why human language should be used to do that and allow for humans to intervene in those types of technologies. Yeah, but and this is like just to note that like if anybody's seen Beauty and the Beast, we don't want everything to sing at us when we get home. So like I think when you think about your agents, right, like chatty agents are helpful in some cases, but not others. So I think like this idea of like how do actants do the translation of mental state or understanding or trust ends up becoming like really important in the way you do the work. And then finally, like we just found out that actually the Roomba was terrified of dog shit. They did not want to deal with it. They wanted the human to come and take care of it first. So that was very interesting, right? And I think if you look at the way the Roombas are actually built now, they try to avoid this thing because they can't deal with it. Like it's not possible based on the mechanisms that they have. So I think, again, like this was another case where role play kind of helped us understand a bit more about like what's actually, and there were actually like 3 Roomba employees or iRobot employees that were in this workshop. It's pretty funny. So that's it. I mean, I wanted to just say that. Again, I'll share the code, but I would like to go into discussion, and I'll stop sharing. Yeah, go ahead. Amir.
Amir, go on.
Thank you so much, Chris. I just wanted to check with you on what you think of in terms of security of these agents, and where is the line needs to be drawn, because if you stifle too much, the creativity goes away. But if you actually expand a lot of guardrails, then you probably, it's more like a DB lookup kind of a thing, right? Like there is not much innovation, creativity going on. So where is that? I mean, I know there's no one answer to this question, but
there isn't. Yeah, there isn't, unfortunately. But I think like a way to think about this is that, and actually, let me just drop this design policies article by Pear. And so this is something that I helped work on before I left Google. So they think about this idea of like, what we want to actually do is that there are failure cases that are acceptable in this, right? And so I think the thing that you need to do is you need to, one, I think just through the idea of like what was referred to as like red teaming, you can start to actually look at like inside of GitHub, for example, we have huge data sets that are like basically adversarial prompts or harms that could result in harms when using Copilot, right? But there's also other things that we do. Like I was just having an interesting conversation the other day about like, what is a harmful regex? And that's a really weird question, but it's one we have to consider. And so like, I think what we're looking for is you should be building a body of knowledge, which is what are the red teaming kind of things. I think another thing that you can do is I used to do this workshop that was based off of like confusion matrices, and I called it like confusion mapping. But when we're looking for the false positives and false negatives that start happening, what you want to look at is like, what are the actual harms that can take place for a human being in that case, right? And so then you should build test cases around those particular harms. So in our case, right, like if someone, like some of the interesting harms could be things like just generating content that has like swear words, violent discussions, things like that. So we try to create test sets that avoid that. Or, you know, maybe people are asking us to write software that is actually harmful itself, right? And so we have test sets that we start to do that. So that's kind of the way that it happens today, is that we start to look at like, what are these vulnerabilities that we know will cause harms in our users, and then we create test sets to make sure that that's not there. But then the problem is that because these are non-deterministic systems, you'll never be able to do everything. So then it becomes like, how do you actually monitor this stuff, both through implicit and explicit type of things? So for example, like you always see the thumbs up, thumbs down thing on a response, right? And that is like an explicit signal that something is wrong, right? It's kind of like everything you do around like moderation of communities, you basically have to do for this now, right? And so like flag is inappropriate is going to be the way that you start to get that signal from people. And then you have to like make sure that that does not get lost in all of the feedback that you're getting. And so you should like pay very, very close attention to any signal that comes from that type of thing. So, and then respond to it. So that's what I say. It's like, again, it's like a combination of like, there are things that we just definitely don't want. Like if it results in a swear word coming out, like that's probably just not a good response, right? And that's a very heuristic driven type of thing, right? Now, some things are swear words in some cases and not others, and that's where you get into like a gray area, right? But you could build an agent. Like actually one of the Google's public agents, and they have a model card for it, is around toxicity. And so that is actually that's a model that's more of like a classifier, but it actually looks at toxic things, and they've done an awful lot to actually make it so that it's fair, in the sense that like, for one of the interesting things that was coming out of that issue was that certain terminology like gay, for example, was being highlighted as toxic when it is actually a valid thing to say in, say, LBGT types of like circumstances. And so they had to do a lot of work on that model to make it equitable and fair. But that's an example of like a model that is actually a guardrail as well. Because, and so you could imagine that that's another agent. There's like an agent that is like, is this the right type of thing to send to a user or not, right? That you could start to build that is much simpler, but also means that it's going to go wrong less of the time, right? And then you have these like wild animals that are like the really dynamic systems in some way. So that's what I'd say.
Richard?
Yes. You should always be building adversarial agents into your agent set, is what I would argue. Like you should find out what the opposite is of whatever your agent is and see how it interoperates, because it will help you in the cases where it's doing the wrong thing, probably. Yeah, sorry, Richard.
Okay, so yeah, the interaction, the expectation of the human being of the LLM is very interesting. So like one thing we ran into just real quick in sort of trying to rewrite these descriptions of product descriptions.
Yeah.
One of the things the LLM did was it made it more formal because it thought that was the right thing to do. And then we actually using LLM to evaluate the response, and it said, oh, I did a better job because it's more formal. And it's like, that's not necessarily what people really want.
Yes, that's right.
So that was kind of interesting. Anyhow, just to comment.
No, and there was like a paper that just came out like in the last couple of months about kind of using multi-agent systems in translation that I thought was really good. And the thing that was very interesting about that was that the output from the ensemble of agents, where they had like a junior translator, a senior translator, an editor, and a judger, basically, the output of that multi-agent system got a lower score on the automated translation benchmarks, but the people said that they liked those translations better. And so I think this is where we're getting to this realm that like benchmarking is really hard for this type of stuff. So I think you should use those types of things in some way, but I would argue that like what really matters is how do the humans feel about the output of the system. That's really what matters, right? So yeah, I think it's an interesting story to maybe convey that point.
Maybe I'll ask a follow-up on that before going to Evo. So, obviously most people in this course are, playing with these kind of systems.
Yeah.
That toy project kind of thing where they don't have access to, business data and all that. So what's a good way to define good quantitatively in your mind? Because, an answer to that problem was, sit down and figure out what good means, what data represents that good, and what tool can be used to make that measurement and use that to give feedback, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think because these are you know, earlier systems or smaller systems or prototype systems, I mean, I would just go to user research. So like you should have human beings interacting and trying out your systems, right? You're not going to get it perfect at first. And so, I mean, this is something that when I was at Philosophy, like we would do a lot of prototyping for machine learning systems, but we would do them in like, we'd build a prototype in a couple days. Sometimes they were fake, sometimes they were using some real technologies. And then we would basically ask 3 to 5 people to try to complete a task. And even that small amount of signal gave us amazing amounts of information about like what is actually valuable to the human being there. So I think like, I get that you know, we don't have all the business information flowing in and stuff like that. Whenever that's the case, I go to qualitative when it comes to because that is data still. It's just that you as a human being are now interpreting this quali data. But that's where I would go, honestly, because it's the easiest thing to just like go and understand for you and your intuition around something, right? Now, because of prompts and prompt engineering is like a weird iterative type of cycle, I would say it's not always going to help you in those cases. It's kind of like the idea that like those types of user research will help you identify problems and won't give you the right solution necessarily. It's, I don't know, I learned this from like, is it Bill Hader, the comedian? He was talking about how like, and again, this I take stuff from like different domains, and so that's why like the stuff maybe doesn't always make sense to you, but like it makes sense to me. But like he was talking about how like great writing, usually if you have someone read your script or story and they complain about a bunch of things and they give you a bunch of stuff to change, you should actually just ignore the solutions they're giving you. You should just look at the problems, and then you as the artist should actually fix the problem the way you think is appropriate. And so I would say the same thing is true for these types of systems. Like you want people to identify frictions that they're not able to get the job done or whatever that is, and then it's up to you to actually do it. So I'm sorry, that's maybe a little bit of a, yeah. What else?
Sorry, can you repeat the name of that translation article? I can't
Oh,
find
yeah.
it as you're answering another question. Like, don't worry about it. I'll just, if you remember the title.
Yeah, I had it written down. It's harnessing multi-agent collaboration. Here, let me get I have it right here.
Yeah.
I think it's like actually perhaps is what they say. Perhaps beyond, perhaps beyond human translation.
Okay.
Is what it's called. It's a really interesting paper. Like again, like you should check it out because I think it kind of points towards like how multi-agent, or I mean, again, these were referred to as ensemble systems a few years ago. Now we're calling them multi-agent, but and now eventually everything is just going to be agent, I think. But like from a hype perspective, but I think it is interesting that like we should be talking about how this type of emergent behavior for these systems is actually helpful.
Absolutely.
Yeah, Chris, you also talked about voice assistants. I'm also looking into that and struggling also with it, how to do it. So first question is, for example, of course, Alexa is like a real mature product, but do they also use like a multi-agent logic, or is it?
So the traditional way that these systems, the short answer is that nowadays, yes. But like the short answer was that before a lot of it was about, first there was like the speech to text technology that would be like Nuance or Google or Whisper or whatever, right? Where you're getting like a string, basically text. And then back in the day, we would do something called intent matching. And so that was like Dialogflow or something like that. And it would then be forced into basically a conversation direction. And when I was working at a place called IPsoft, where we had something called Amelia, which was basically like a support agent that could do voice or text or whatever. There were very specific processes that these systems had to follow. And the reason why was that, like if you call up a credit card company and you say you want a new credit card, it should not just like guess what you want to do and like make up the process for getting a new credit card. It needs to follow, like in these large credit card companies, it needs to follow like 18 different steps and engaging with 18 different systems, in your case, tools is what you'd probably call them, to actually get a credit card like stopped, reordered, delivered, right? And so I think that's something that's very interesting about, I think, these multi-agent systems is that just like in human teams, we outline processes sometimes, right? We should be doing the same thing. And actually that's something I've been experimenting with around like, a lot of my work is like setting up new process cadence, things like that. And so I've been starting to create like documents that are almost like prompts for how an agent crew should work together in some way. And Fabric is something I've been taking a lot of. Are you familiar? If people are not familiar with Fabric, it's kind of an open source project for like prompt chaining and stuff like that, but as like as a productivity tool, which is interesting. And so like in those cases, I think there's something really interesting about like how do we start to set these processes that are more rigid because we know they need to do certain things versus this idea of like we want dynamicism when we're, say, creating a new text, right?
Exactly.
But we also want to spell check it, right? And we also want to make sure it's compliant and something like that. So anyways, that's what I'd say. So that's the long answer, but nowadays they do use, like, there's a lot of integration of LLMs to do intent matching, which then link to skills on the other side. And, you know, Amazon's canceling Alexa because of the fact that they're not selling anything through it. But I mean, it was an interesting technology.
And also, just a quick question on like latency, because I can imagine if you have multi-agents in a real-time conversation, you don't want to wait for like 20 seconds before the checker agents checks the output of the conversation agent, so to say.
Well, yeah, I mean, this is where I think like you have to decide where things are actually exposed to the customer or the user or not, right? And yeah, there is latency right now. Things are getting faster, right? Like 4.0 is pretty fast. Like it's, so we're getting into that realm where I don't think that's going to be as much of an issue, but there are affordances. Like for example, one of the things we used to do for Amelia, I forget what they called it. It was called an ear icon. I think it was something like that, but it's like, if you've ever been on an automated system and you ask something and then you hear it like click clacking on keys, like that's the ... kind of thing inside of like chat, right? And so I think you do need to build it's basically like it's an affordance for someone to understand what is going on. So you have to decide whether, if there's a high possibility for harm, you should hold back that response until the appropriate agents have like checked it. And that's what LLMs do today. They go through all stages of those different checks. It's just that they happen to be very, like, the toxicity filter is very fast, right? Things like that. So I just say, like, you have to build UX affordances for this type of thing if it is a hazard that you might have, right?
Thanks.
Yeah.
Antonio.
You're muted.
We are trying to read your lips, but our agents are not that good yet.
I'm not very good at that.
We still cannot hear you. Nope, cannot hear you. Nope.
I think it's just only
reading your lips, but
yeah, if you want to type your question in too, if you can.
Maybe type it. I'll be your voice.
Yeah, no problem.
Okay. So while Antonio types his question, so as I mentioned, Chris, you know, the folks in the course are at a stage where they're translating from their product descriptions and product requirement document into agentic architectures. And one of the big questions that comes up is, what's the right level of modularity in these systems, right? Because how many agents do I need? You know, how should they interact? How do I design all of this? And you went into a lot of details that, you know, that's how you will figure out what the answer is. But, you know, can you recap and give, you know, the steps 1 to 3 to go through that process?
Yeah, I mean, I guess one of the things that I think about, and I think this is stolen a lot from like organizational design, honestly, is how do you build tensions between people and agents? So for example, what you should be thinking about is in that like actor network theory, it's like, what's the translation between these things that allow them to pull in different directions, but create something that is better holistically? And so I think about those tensions an awful lot. Like if there's no tension, like if these agents are just going to do the same thing and they're going to be, you know, you probably don't need them to be separate agents, right? If they're going to be in agreement, for example, they probably don't need to be separate agents. If they will disagree or edit each other in some way, they probably should be different agents, because you want like a really good writer agent and you want a really good editor agent. And actually, just even for human beings, by the way, like a trick to writing is you should either be writing or editing, but you should never do both. And so like, I think that's an example. So anyways, that's my mind process. Is I think I will list out like, what are the end states that I want to get to? And then I think about going backwards, like what are all the different steps that need to be there? And then in all of those steps, where are there tensions between those different steps that are helpful? And if there is tension between those steps, then those should be different agents, in my opinion. That's at least where I'd start. Now, again, like you should go and role play it and actually see whether it's interesting or helpful or But that's what I would argue.
So that's a very helpful heuristic.
Yeah.
So if there is attention, hopefully that means better things will come out of a discourse. But I'm traveling the States right now. There's a lot of tension between right and left, and there seems to be that you're not making progress. So I think there's another thing that is needed, like a mechanism for discourse or rules of debate or something.
Well, yeah. So yes, I think like this is where we're talking about the process by which the crew will then operate, essentially. But I also think that the problem with when we're talking about like left-right discourse is that there's not a desire to actually move forward, right? There's not a desire to satisfy. There's not a desire to make trade-offs. So I think this is where, like, when you're creating your prompts and things like that, you should be making it very clear that this agent is trying to be helpful, not obstructive, right? Is what I would argue. And again, you need to play with this because it's like prompt engineering is such a weird thing that like you just need to like play with it a bit. But I would argue that it's kind of like, you want, like inside of organizations, you want to assume positive intent of everybody, right? Ideally, in like a trustworthy organization. So that's what I would argue is that like, I think that's where you need to make sure that all of them are working towards a common goal, but they have different objectives. And kind of from that standpoint, maybe also looking at things like multiplayer games is interesting. So there's like a whole type of game called Coin, which is counterinsurgency. And I forget what the full terminology is. But these games actually have like multiple people. They're usually based on historical situations, but they have different victory conditions. And so actually giving people different victory conditions, like for example, I made sure that, your goal is to make sure there's no spelling errors. Right? That can be a different and parallel success with you made something that was interesting to someone, right? Those can be two things that are different goals. They could be a little obstructive in some ways. Like I could imagine maybe if you want to create a new word, that would be an obstruction. So anyways, sorry, I know Antonio has been.
No, I mean, yeah, 100%.
I have a few minutes extra too, so I can stick around.
No worries. Well, the biggest thing I'm getting from this conversation, which is amazing, is that like you really have to have empathy in mind when you kind of create these like agent systems. And you mentioned the role-playing workshop, which I think is amazing. I just wanted to know if there's like other workshops or exercises as well that you can do for yourself or with the team to actually promote that empathy, like thought in mind, because I've been arguing that AI is, a lot of people are worried and about security and whatnot, but there's an opportunity here to create empathy awareness with the user and the agents themselves.
Yeah, and I would say just like talking to customers is the most important thing, right? Like you as a human being doing user research is incredibly important, is what I would say. And then to follow up on that, like there are a bunch of different things. Like if you want to talk about like moral and ethical decision making, there was a paper called Moral Imaginations that came out of a Google research group. And that's a workshop where we try to actually take the values of the organization and then apply it to a hypothetical situation to role play how we might make a hard moral decision when building something. Because technologies do, as much as we want to say technology is unbiased, it's actually the values of the person that builds it are actually embedded inside the technology in some ways. And so you can build agents that are more empathetic or not, right? Or trying to help a person or not. Or a system can be like the last case of the Paris-Surman paper is called abuse, which is where we do not actually look at the operator as someone that we care about of the system. We just care about the designer and the manager, which want the extractive properties of the system. So I think like that's an important thing. If you do want to so Moral Imaginations, the role play thing, I actually do those as workshops in my course as well. And so I can send out articles if you're interested on some of this stuff. But like, if you do want to deep dive into these things, those are things that I cover in my course if you want to check it out.
Okay, awesome. Thank you.
Yeah.
Jayan, last question, and then we let Chris go.
Sure.
Yeah. So this is more around like how do you model it? You talked about one where you sort of want opposites to sort of talk and debate to get an answer, but there are times when we also decompose the task because the task is too big. In that scenario.
Well, yeah, I guess I would ask about that because I think because when we're talking about like multi-agents doing something right together, I would wonder whether that really long, that big task actually should be more like steps of like a bigger system rather than multi-agents trying to coordinate together. Because I think like what you'll find, right, is like they get lost, right? Like you can give them an objective. It's too far away from the system's ability to then get the chain to there. Like they'll get lost and do a bunch of other weird shit, and like they'll go off the rails or go like, you know, Mira and I were just talking about like looping inside these systems. There's ways to detect that, and I would say that like you should, you know, potentially just like pull the plug on those types of situations. And so you can build heuristics to look at like looping and things like that, and that's something you could just do. But I would argue that then in that case, maybe one, it should be decomposed into actually bigger steps where each step has multiple agents that are operating. And then two, is there a need for human intervention inside of those different tasks? So like, do you want, because like the more of these agents that you chain together, the more likely they're just going to be weird, and errors will propagate. So what I would say is like, you need to look at the state of the technology, and then should a human being actually be involved at this step to like check something, for example. So that's what I would argue is like, it sounds like maybe you should break this into like an overall process, that there are parts where there's ensembles or multi-agent systems that are operating. You know what I mean? Yeah, so that's what I would argue. Yes.
Excellent. I'm gonna stop the recording.